Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for this month's University of Wisconsin Division of Extension's Badger Dairy Insight, a monthly webinar series offered on the third Tuesday of each month. Badger Dairy Insight provides the latest research, dairy-based information to improve animal welfare, breeding and genetic selection, automation and modernization, and nutritional decisions for producers, dairy workers and managers, and agriculture professionals. My name is Erica Bierstrom, Regional Dairy Educator for Brown, Door, and Kewaunee counties, and I will be your host today. We hope to provide you this opportunity for additional discussion on today's topic. Since this is a webinar format, please add any questions or comments in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. As this webinar is being recorded, we will send you a link to the recorded webinar within a week in hopes of sharing it with others you work with. Our speaker today is Dr. Catie Cramer. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Animal Sciences at Colorado State University and has been on the faculty since 2019. Dr. Cramer received her MS and PhD in dairy science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she focused on dairy calf health, welfare, and behavior. The overall goal of Dr. Cramer's current research program is to identify effective solutions that improve human and animal well-being in livestock operations. Her recent projects regarding calf health have investigated strategies to prevent disease in calves and provide valuable information about dairy calves' condition before and after transport in the Western United States. She enjoys productive collaborations with dairy stakeholders, students, and colleagues to co-create solutions that help dairy cattle and the people who care for them. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Cramer.
Thanks, Erica. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. And I'll be talking about dairy calf transport today. And so I really want us to be thinking about how we can prepare calves for the road ahead. So we'll talk kind of about four different areas today. First is get us thinking about why we should care about calf transportation. The second is how do early life transport and peri-transport, just meaning the time around transportation, how does our management of those times affect calves? How can we minimize transportation stress for calves? And then what do we need to consider about the supply chain? So approximately 9.5 million calves are born annually in the US, and we can kind of think of these in two different buckets, replacement calves and non-replacements. For our replacement heifers, we know that approximately 40% of those are raised off-site, and the data that we have suggests that they're transported at about 3 days of age. And 15% of operations transport replacement calves more than 50 miles. And typically what we see is that these replacements are going from the dairy, they're transported, and they go directly to their destination in most cases. For our non-replacement calves, these can be male, our bull dairy calves, or our beef on dairy. And those bull calves have historically had low value, although we know recently prices have been really high for those animals. And because of that historical low value, we've sometimes seen that these calves are managed a little bit differently. But again, I think we're starting to see that change, which is really positive. And then beef on dairy, which really has just been increasing in popularity across the US. For this group of calves, there's pretty limited data, but we do know that most of those animals in the US are transported off the dairy at less than a week of age. Some data we have from the Western US is showing that over 60% of them are transported at less than 24 hours of age, and they're going an average distance of 140 miles, but that can range and we can have them closer, closer location to the dairy or, across the US really. And many times what we see with these non-replacements is that they're going to have multiple transport events before they get to their final destination. So from the dairy farm, they're transported maybe to an auction facility, a calf dealer, etc. And then they're transported again to their final destination. And sometimes they might go through one, two, three, or four transportation events before they get to their final destination. So, from the audience, I'd really like to know what are your goals for your calf program? So, I want us to take a step back here and think about overall what are our goals for our calf program? And what are the goals for the calves that you sell? And so, if you can pop those in the chat.
We might just give people a couple of minutes to kind of think about that, and you can kind of maybe move to the next slide. And then if somebody does put something in, we'll make sure that we bring that up, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, that's totally fine. And so then I want us to also think about what gets in the way of achieving these goals. And so most of the time, if we think about our replacement heifers, that's going to be we want them to live a productive life, to go on to enter the milk herd, and be productive in that way. We want often our calves to remain healthy, to grow well, and that really should include thinking about the goals of calves, even if they leave our dairy. So, how do we set them up for success on our dairy, to be healthy, productive animals down the road? And so, thinking about those goals, um, I'm going to show some data today that really demonstrates that transportation is stressful for young calves. And when young calves get stressed, they become more susceptible to disease, and disease decreases animal performance. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So, early life transportation can be a bottleneck to success in calf raising. So, it's this early life event that maybe happens once or twice early in their life. But really, I want us to think about that event can be stressful, and how can we change our management so that we can really set them up for success. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're really transporting calves less than a week of age and often less than 24 hours of age. So, those are neonates, right? And those young animals are really susceptible to stress and disease, right? Anyone who's raising calves right now knows that, right? Those little babies are tough to care for sometimes. And we really have to make sure we do everything right to really set them up for success. And transportation is no different. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but really what I want you to notice and take away from this is that calves have underdeveloped immune systems and underdeveloped physiologic stress responses. So they can't respond to disease or stress in the same way that older animals can. And so it affects them a little bit more. And really, what I want you to notice is that this is the age of the calf right here along that arrow. And maternal antibodies, so those antibodies that they're getting from colostrum, really don't peak until about 3 or 4 days of life. Often we're transporting them before that. So they haven't even had a chance for those maternal antibodies to really peak and be the most effective. Also, those young calves, as many of you probably know, they're really susceptible to cold stress or heat stress. And so, thinking about that on a day like today, how's it going to affect that calf if we put a day-old calf on a trailer when it's really cold outside? So, just keeping in mind that, we're dealing with a unique animal here. We know transportation is stressful for adult animals, but it's really hard on these young calves. So, why should we care about calf transport? Um, Transportation, we all probably think of that as like a stressful event for most animals. We know that there's commingling, so they might be on a trailer with other animals, extreme weather conditions. If the person handling them isn't trained properly, they can experience improper handling. For calves, especially if there's a lack of bedding, or if they might be exposed to additional pathogens. And oftentimes, what we see with calves is that they don't have access to milk or water on the trailer, and oftentimes they don't have access to milk during marketing either. And so, what that really means for the calf is that they can become dehydrated. They might experience discomfort, disease. Their energy stores are depleted, right? They don't have the same type of energy stores that an older animal has. And so, if they're off of feed for a longer period of time, that can really negatively affect them. They might experience fear, hunger, injury, thermal stress, like we talked about, and thirst. And so all of those um, are types of stressors that they experience, right? And so we know that stress can increase susceptibility to disease, right? We know if something happens, how we're mixing up milk for a week or so, we're probably going to see the effect of that in a couple weeks when those calves get sick from that, if they were stressed or a really cold snap, and then, how do those calves recover afterwards? And so when we think about transportation stress, those animals are experiencing thermal stress, nutritional stress, and they're also commingled with other animals. And so all of those really can make them more susceptible to disease. And I think here's when we're thinking about a productive calf and how we make them, ultimately be um, successful in the milking herd, or if they're going to meet, really it comes down to early life growth. And we know that disease impacts average daily gain. And depending on the study and the disease, there's an average daily gain loss of anywhere from zero point zero 0.01 to 1.7 pounds per day. And for our replacement heifers, pre-weaned average daily gain affects their future milk production. So for every 1 pound of pre-weaned average daily gain, first lactation milk yield increases by 1,200 pounds. So if we have a calf that's sick and is losing weight, um, we know that they're going to lose just right off the bat $255 based on the current price of milk in their first lactation. When we think about our animals going to beef, calfhood disease and poor growth is associated with reduced carcass quality, reduced hot carcass weight, lower price at auction. They also might require additional treatments, an increased age at first calving, labor costs, mortality, and treatment costs. So again, if we take a step back and we think about our goals for our calf program, which is that we want a healthy, productive animal, whether they're going to make milk or going to beef. And we know that early life stress can impact that and make them more susceptible to disease. So hopefully you've kind of seen now that early life transportation is stressful. It can make them more susceptible to disease and it can reduce performance. And if we don't manage this properly, it can really be a bottleneck to success in our calf raising programs. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the data we have at each stage of the transport process. And really, it starts out on the dairy farm before they get on that trailer and preparing them for transport. So, colostrum practices on the source dairy are going to vary. As I mentioned previously, those male dairy calves that have historically had lower value, they're more likely to receive contaminated colostrum. delayed colostrum feedings, lower total volume of colostrum. And anywhere in Canada, they found that approximately 12% of calves had failed transfer of passive immunity, so they didn't get good quality colostrum, enough of it, or at the right time. And similarly, in the US, we found about 23% of those calves had failed transfer of passive immunity. So, colostrum is really something we can do at the source dairy. And if we get that right, we're automatically, beginning to set them up for success. So this is a survey that we recently did, and Jackie and Erica and UW Extension really helped us with this. And so we surveyed dairy producers and we asked them about different practices prior to transportation. And we broke it out by replacement heifers, beef on dairy, and dairy bull calves. And so this is showing that, um, you know, which percent of operations or how many operations rather provided colostrum at each time interval. And so you can see that really the majority of operations for all calf classes were less than 2 hours, which really, we think of that as being the standard is getting colostrum into those calves early. But we did see that more operations fed colostrum to replacements earlier than non-replacements. And so that did differ based on calf class a little bit. So this is looking at colostrum quantity by calf class. And again, I think it's really positive that you can see that the majority of operations are giving at least 4 quarts of colostrum before that calf gets on the trailer. And we didn't see a difference in quantity either. So whether they were a replacement heifer, a dairy bull, or a bull calf, they got similar quantities of colostrum across operations. So then we asked about preconditioning. And preconditioning is often a term used in beef cattle and thinking about how do we prepare them for their next phase of their life. But I really think we can think about preconditioning in our young dairy calves and thinking about what are some practices we can implement at the dairy before that calf gets on the trailer that really help set them up for success. And the data is super limited right now, but this again is that survey data showing what are operations doing. So less than 30% of operations are feeding some sort of electrolyte prior to the calf getting on the trailer. Over 80%, whether they were replacement heifers, beef on dairy, or bull calves, were doing navel dipping. Less than 30% did some sort of supplement. And depending on calf class, anywhere from 25 to 60% of those calves received vaccines prior to getting on the trailer. But so we can think about, okay, how do we implement some management practices that set that calf up for success? But what is often talked about in adult cattle is fitness for transport. And so, is that animal going to be able to withstand that transportation, withstand that journey without compromising their welfare? And I think we need to think about that in these young calves too, about what condition we're shipping them in. So, this is a separate study from Canada, and they looked at the health of calves prior to shipping. And they found that almost 40% of calves had at least one health abnormality. So things like diarrhea, navel inflammation, poor body condition, etc. And the average age of calves in this study was about 5 days of age. Some data we collected here in the Western US showed that about half of calves had at least one health abnormality. The most calves were less than 24 hours of age, but they were up to 3 days of age. And so we saw things like, again, navel inflammation, diarrhea, labored breathing, things like that. And so as we think about setting the animal up for success, it not only includes management practices at the source dairy, but it also includes making sure that we're not shipping compromised calves or calves in poor condition. So back to our survey that we did that UW helped us with. So this includes Wisconsin herds, and this is all states across the US. This is looking at the proportion of dairies that would transport calves with these conditions. So for diarrhea, 20 to 30% of operations said they would transport calves with diarrhea. Between 20 and 35% said they would transport calves with dehydration. 30 to about 55% said navel inflammation, they would still ship a calf. And 30 to 40% said that they would ship a calf if they've not received, they'd ship a calf that has not received the minimum feeding of colostrum. And this is the Wisconsin herds. So same study, just Wisconsin herds. Um, Anywhere from 5% to less than 30% would ship calves with diarrhea, 20 to 35% with dehydration, 40 to 55% with navel inflammation, and 40 to 50% wouldn't ship a calf if they've not received the minimum feeding of colostrums. So this is I think Wisconsin overall is a little bit lower than national. And so I think that's a positive direction, and we can keep working to ensure we're not shipping calves in suboptimal conditions. When we're shipping those calves, compromised calves, so sick or injured calves, it really puts them at a greater risk for poor welfare. Those stressors that we talked about earlier that are associated with transportation, those are going to be worse in an animal that's in poor condition. And disease conditions can worsen as well throughout their journey, especially when you think about those calves that might not be going directly to their destination, but they might be transported to an auction facility or a calf dealer, and they might go through one, two, or three transport events before they get to their destination. So when some studies in Canada have looked at kind of longer term impacts. And so they measured the health of the calves at the dairy before they got on the truck. And then they looked at how those animals performed at the calf raiser. And so if a calf had a navel infection at the source dairy, they were almost 3 times more likely to be treated for diarrhea at the calf raiser. If they were dull or depressed at the dairy before getting on that trailer, they were 2.5 times more likely to die at the calf raiser. So we're really seeing some impacts that if we put a calf who's not healthy on that trailer, we're seeing those consequences at the calf raiser. So again, I keep going back to this concept, but I really think it's critical for us to think about. Yes, transport is, it doesn't happen typically doesn't happen multiple times over an animal's life, and they're going to have a couple events when they're younger, but it can be stressful for those animals, making them more susceptible to disease and reducing that performance that's so important in our calf raising programs. So, we've talked about what happens at the dairy. Now, what happens during transport for those calves? When we think of the different characteristics of transport for calves, typically we're withholding milk or water. They might experience improper handling if there's the people who are transporting them haven't been trained properly. There might be a lack of bedding. We know that calves, when they're transported, they're going to spend the majority of their time laying down on that trailer. They might be exposed to pathogens. They are going to be commingled and extreme weather conditions. And so all of those can lead to things like energy depletion, hypoglycemia or low blood sugar, stress, fear, discomfort, injury, and dehydration. And we saw that those can have long-term consequences for those calves as well. For marketing, that's an additional stressor for those animals. We know that about 70% of male calves are going to go through auctions in the US, and they're typically unloaded at a facility that they've never, it's a new environment, lots of new animals. There might be a variety of different ways that they're handled, some good, some maybe not so good, and they're commingled as well. So just additional challenges there. And oftentimes they don't have access to feeder water as well. When we look at the condition of calves at auctions, approximately 20% of calves at auctions in Canada arrived with at least one of the following. So they measured health at the auction when they were getting off the trailer. Navel disease was most common. They found iron nasal discharge, depressed attitude or dull, unable or unwilling to rise or stand, coughing, and joint inflammation. So these are animals that were either got on the trailer with bad, with poor condition, or their condition during transport, deteriorated. And now finally, when we look at the condition of calves at their destination, so when they looked at some bob veal in the US, approximately 96% of them had at least one health abnormality. 82% had at least two health abnormalities. In the Western US, we looked at non-replacements going to a calf ranch, and over half of those calves were dehydrated. So this is our survey data again. This includes all states, and this is the proportion, but instead of dairy producers, this is calf raisers. So we asked calf raisers, what conditions are you seeing as those calves get off the trailer? 75% had diarrhea, 65% reported seeing navel inflammation, over half reported dehydration and difficulty breathing. And then we saw all operations also reported failed transfer of passive immunity, respiratory disease, bone fractures, severe lameness, non-ambulatory, and thin. So this is, again, all states. And then when we look at that compared to just the Wisconsin herds, we're definitely seeing fewer calf raisers reporting those conditions. So the most frequently reported condition by calf raisers just in Wisconsin was difficulty breathing, followed by diarrhea, navel inflammation, and then similar proportion of operations reported bone fractures, dehydration, failed transfer of passive immunity, respiratory disease, severe lameness, and non-ambulatory. So again, we've got to manage those calves properly at the dairy and make sure that we're not shipping animals in compromised conditions, because we are seeing calves arriving to their destination in suboptimal condition. So now I want us to think about how we can minimize transportation stress for calves. So we know it's stressful, but right now it's a reality of our supply chain, right? So what can we do to make things better for those calves? I'm going to talk about five. The first one is going to be retaining calves on the source dairy for longer. Second is focusing on preconditioning. Third is assessing fitness for transport. Fourth is handling calves with care. And then the last one is reducing transport duration and events. And so some of these might be easier to implement than the other, but I think they're all important for us to consider and to discuss as we go forward. So, keeping calves at the source dairy for longer. This just means waiting until they're a little bit older to ship them. Um, I'm going to talk through a couple studies here that looked at different age ranges of calves. And so in Canada, they found that compared to calves who were 2 to 6 days of age, calves who were over 7 days of age had greater average daily gain during the first 50 days at a veal facility and reduced incidence of abnormal respiratory score. So if they were older when we shipped them, they had better average daily gain and less respiratory disease. Similarly, calves 2 to 6 days of age, compared to 12 to 19, those older animals had a reduced odds of naval inflammation at the veal facility. In the US, we found in the Western US, compared to calves less than 24 hours of age, calves who were at least 1 day of age had reduced odds of being dehydrated prior to transport. And in fact, we found that just one more day at the source dairy reduced the odds of dehydration by 5 times. So if we can keep them at least past that 24-hour mark, the data that we have so far suggests that that's beneficial for the calf. And now focusing on preconditioning. So again, what management practices can we do that really set that calf up for success? First and foremost, it's colostrum. Good quality colostrum in a timely manner, and making sure that we're giving that to all calves, including the calves that are leaving the dairy. The other thing for preconditioning is navel disinfection. So I told you that calves are going to spend the majority of their time on the trailer laying down, and they might also be exposed to pathogens. And so when those calves, when their navels are not fully healed, it can really act as a wick and take up any, bacteria that are in the environment. And they can go straight to the liver, the bladder, and cause some really systemic issues for that calf. So making sure that we have disinfected those navels and that we have a really clean environment for those calves. Next is milk and water. So milk is going to be really what we know so far is really going to be the best thing to prepare calves for transport. And so if we can make sure that they have access to milk before transportation, and especially if you can get them a milk feeding as close to transport as possible, that's going to be ideal for maintaining their hydration, their electrolytes, and also making sure that they are not hungry and they don't have challenges with energy balance. Also, providing some sort of at least access to water during marketing, especially, can be beneficial for these calves as well. The third thing, and I think this is really critical, is to assess fitness for transport. We've put a lot of effort into doing this for adult cows, and rightfully so. But we really need to be doing the same thing in our calves as well. So we know calves are well prepared for transport when they receive high quality colostrum in a timely manner, when they get navels disinfected, when they have access to milk and water, when they're older. And conversely, calves with any abnormal health conditions are not fit for transport and we should not put them on the trailer. So if a calf is dehydrated, if they're showing signs of illness or injury, if they're lethargic or depressed, if they have navel swelling, if they're unable to stand on their own, those are really those calves that we should not be shipping, and we should, provide them proper care immediately. Next is handling calves with care. Calves are not cows, obviously, and so they can be kind of difficult to get loaded. So go slow and be patient, be gentle, um, and consider time of day and season. So if it's really hot outside, can we try shipping them during cooler parts of the day? Similarly, the opposite for winter, can we try shipping them during the warmer part of the day? Um, if we want to make sure that they have plenty of clean and dry bedding, that is going to help them maintain their warmth. And then if it's really cold, can we do something like a calf jacket to give them a little bit extra energy? Or, excuse me, a little bit extra warmth during those really cold days. And finally, this one's probably with our current supply chain, one of the more difficult ones to implement, but it's really important for us to consider. So, and that is reducing the transport duration and the events. So, one thing I think is important to note is that just because maybe the calf raiser is 30 miles away doesn't mean that that calf is gonna go straight there. So they might pick up multiple other calves on the route, and so that calf might be on that trailer for 8 hours, even though the calf ranch is only 30 miles away. So just keep that in mind. One study looked at transporting calves 16 hours versus 6 hours, and those animals who were transported for longer had higher levels of dehydration, greater body weight loss, and an increased incidence of diarrhea after transport. So we really saw that duration of transport be long lasting. A New Zealand study found that for each additional hour in transit, the odds of mortality increased by 1.5 times. So, as I mentioned, just keep in mind distance doesn't necessarily correlate to duration. Also, can we think about shipping these calves direct to their destination rather than going through auction facilities or calf dealers? And are there options closer to the dairy farm that we can consider? What about a rest period? So this study recently looked at this. This again was in Canada, and they looked at two different groups of calves. One who spent 16 hours in transit, and the other who did 8 hours in transit, an 8 hour rest period with two milk feedings, and 8 hours in transit. And these were 9 to 10 day old calves. And they found that calves that that had the rest period and milk um, maintained energy and had higher growth, but they spent more time lying the next day, and the authors thought this might be due to fatigue. And so, really, we don't have very good data right now to say if a rest period is beneficial for young calves. But if we really set them up for success and think about some of those other things I mentioned, that's going to go a long way to helping these calves. So, what do we need to consider about the supply chain? So, the calf procurement model, so how we buy and sell calves, it is challenging, right? And I think we see this with adult cattle too. Um, but really, it's about accountability throughout the supply chain. How can we build that in? And how can we make sure that at each stage of this calf's transport journey, that they're well cared for and that we're setting them up for success? There's also, I think, a bit of a disconnect in the supply chain. So on our survey that we did of dairy producers and calf raisers, we asked them, so we asked dairy producers, would you add additional preconditioning practices? And we asked calf raisers, would you require additional preconditioning practices? So over 80% of dairies and over 80% of calf raisers said, yeah, they would either add or require additional preconditioning practices. And then we asked, what's the minimum premium that you would need um, to implement those changes? And dairy producers said we'd need a minimum of $10 a head to implement that. And calf raisers said we'd be willing to pay up to $5 per head. So I think there's just a little bit of a disconnect there, and I think that's not unique to calves or to the dairy industry either. We also asked producers about their challenges relative to calf transport. The top three challenges named by dairies were labor costs when calf prices are low and space availability for calves if transport is delayed. For calf raisers, they said their biggest challenge was calf health on arrival, the distance from dairies, and then calf health challenges during the milk feeding phase. So, what opportunities are there to improve this procurement model? So, I think we can implement management changes that can incrementally improve calf welfare. So, focusing on all those things that we talked about. And we can also think about adding some accountability in throughout the supply chain and then exploring strategies to increase the value of calves. Right now, calf prices are really high, and that is good. But it's challenging when calf prices are low if you're selling those calves. And we can also continue to investigate strategies to mitigate stressors during all phases. So we really need to better understand what's really beneficial for calves, as well as what's practical to implement. And so CCQA, or Calf Care Quality Assurance, um, is one program that is sought to fill the gap of a farm program that's for calf raisers or calf ranches. CCQA now covers that. But other countries, for example, Canadian cattle transport regulations, they have specific requirements for transporting calves. And so, for example, a young ruminant, um, so that's a calf that's on milk, they can't be transported longer than 12 hours. If calves are less than 8 days of age, they have to be loaded and unloaded individually, have ample space to lie down. They have to be segregated from animals that are older than 8 days of age, not transported to an assembly center, so they can't go through auction markets or assembly yards. They can't be reloaded after they've been unloaded at their final destination, and the start of loading to end of loading must be less than 12 hours. So really other countries have recognized that this is a challenge when we're transporting these young animals, and so they've created some additional regulations because of that. So I think, where do we go from here? I think we have to really increase communication among the supply chain sector. So calf ranches or calf raisers giving feedback to source dairies about how their calves performed, implementing some training programs about fitness for transport, particularly in caring for calves before, during, and after transport, and really thinking about how we can optimize how we manage calves before, during, and after transport. So again, if we really want our calves to reach optimal success, whether that's entering the milking herd or entering the beef supply chain, we've really got to think about minimizing early life stress, and that includes minimizing transportation stress. So I'll just give a shout out to my graduate student who did the survey data that I talked about, Erica Machuca, and then all of the folks at UW Extension, including Jackie and Erica, for helping collect this data, Tina Coleman, Faith Reyes, my collaborators as well. And so I am happy to take questions.
I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but I wrote some questions down for you. Um, what priorities do you see? You went over it a little bit here right at the end, but as a researcher, someone who's been studying this for a long time, what priorities do you see that farmers should try to implement it as soon as they can if they're seeing trouble with their calves, if they're going to the calf ranch and not doing very well? Where can they make changes today if they needed to?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think first and foremost, not shipping calves who are sick or injured. So if that calf isn't vigorous and healthy, don't put it on the trailer. Um, Second would be really preparing those calves for transport. So good colostrum, getting them a milk feeding as close to transport as possible. I think those are some really basic things that we can do right away.
All right. Just like with the cows, it's
Yeah,
just not looking like it needs to go on there. You have a checklist on your farm and go over those checklists and make sure that animal is fit before it gets on a trailer.
absolutely. Yes.
Another question I was thinking about is marketing. So, me personally, I used to work in a packing plant. I was in the receiving barn. I watched a lot of cattle. This was 20 some years ago. Watch cattle get off the trailers and they were in terrible shape. And fortunately, for whatever, for various reasons, that industry has really cleaned up their attitude when it comes to animals unloading at a packing plant, animals that got on a trailer that shouldn't have been on a trailer and didn't make it to the packing plant alive. Do you see any kind of changes that drastic or anything like that with sale barns and calves being received into sale barns? Is this something that could potentially be in our future?
I think maybe it's in the future. I think really it's probably going to come down to each sector of the supply chain really taking ownership and responsibility. And I think we've seen that in adult cattle too. But there is data that shows that calves who are in poor condition are going to bring lower auction prices. And so if we want to talk about the bottom dollar, um, you know, making sure that we put a healthy, vigorous calf on that trailer is really going to be the best thing that we can do. Um, and so I don't know if I foresee any, strict regulations, but I think it's probably going to come down to each sector taking some ownership. And then if there are perhaps disincentives for shipping compromised calves.
Yep. One other thing is, I know there were some questions on that survey for haulers specifically. Are there any kinds or any kind of takeaway messages that you got from haulers regarding that? Do they do training with their drivers? Are there certain sectors of the hauling industry that are better at hauling calves than others, or what did you see out of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think we did see that um, training programs really varied across haulers. And so there were some haulers that reported having, pretty robust training and some that reported having not very much training. And so I think just like we've kind of done some like BQAT, BQAT for transport for beef quality assurance in adult cattle, I think we can really begin to use some of those existing programs and add on some information for calves as well. And most haulers were picking up from multiple operations and before they went to their final destination. And we also saw a pretty wide range of distances. So some were going, a total of 50 miles, and others were going hundreds of miles. So a wide range there as well.
And just knowing kind of the dynamic in Wisconsin about hauling little calves, we know a lot of them are heading out to
Yes.
your area, and
Yeah.
that's thousands of miles. And what's the best strategy for putting those babies on a trailer? And you obviously want to put that vigorous calf on the trailer, but what else do you recommend, especially in temperatures like this? Jackets on those calves, every single calf, feeding right before they leave, or how often?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think so all of those things we talked about, I think making sure they're first and foremost in good condition. If they're not in good condition today when I put them on the trailer, they're not going to be in good condition 20 hours from now. And second is if we can get them a good milk feeding, um, that fills their belly and gives them the energy they need for that time. That's ideal. If it's cold like today, making sure they have plenty of deep, clean straw bedding in that trailer, that's gonna give them some insulation and comfort. And I think, on days like today, probably putting calf jackets on them is a good idea. And then really when they get to that destination, having a crew there that's really ready to kind of give them a little bit of TLC as they're getting off that trailer, making sure that they get up, they eat right away, things like that. So, as I mentioned, we really don't have good data to say whether a rest period is a really good thing or a bad thing. So, I'd say right now, the best things that we can do, take care of them, take good care of them when we at the dairy, make sure they're not, that they are healthy and vigorous when they get put on that trailer, and make sure that trailer is comfortable for them, and then make sure that when they get to their destination, they get some milk in them as soon as possible.
All right, well, I don't see any other questions. Do you have anything else you want to add before we sign off for the day?
I don't think so. If anyone has questions, please feel free to email me, and thanks for having me.
All right. So I just hope that everyone enjoyed our webinar today, focusing on this presentation on fit for transport for calves. Please join us next month, February 18th, for data management and digital tech on predictive analytics to optimize farm management decisions. Oh my goodness, that is a mouthful. Dr. Victor Cabrera and Joao Doria will be our presenters. And to register for that webinar next month, please visit go.wisc.edu/Badger Dairy. And additional information or unbiased University Wisconsin-based dairy resources, please visit the Extension Dairy Program at dairy.extension.wisc.edu or find us online at Wisconsin Agriculture. Thank you for joining us today and stay warm.